Okay, good evening, everybody. My name is Brian Potter. I'm the president of the Princeton-Trenton area chapter of the United Nations Association. And I'm going to have some very brief comments describing our Stevenson Award and the awardee for this year. Before I do that, I'd like to engage in some shameless promotion of the chapter, encouraging you to join. One of our best recruiting tools is the current administration. We, as an association, believe that U.S. interests are better furthered by working with the United Nations instead of going it alone. If you are of such a mind, please join us. If you are a student, you can join for free. If you're not a student, it is very cheap. And again, we are the Princeton-Trenton area chapter of the United Nations Association. So today we're gathered to celebrate Adlai Stevenson II's legacy of commitment to international institutions and to recognize his spirit in the work of others. Adlai Stevenson was a 1922 Princeton graduate, and we are delighted that the Wilson School, complete with a bust of Stevenson in the main hall, is our gracious host and partner in awarding this prize. In addition to serving as governor of Illinois and two-time Democratic presidential nominee, Stevenson was present at the creation of the United Nations. Shortly after the founding of the UN, Stevenson toured the United States, promoting the UN's value in pursuing U.S. foreign policy objectives. Later in 1961, President Kennedy tapped Stevenson as the U.S. representative to the UN, a role he continued under the Johnson administration. Stevenson's convictions regarding the UN and his relentless work in advocacy emphasize the value of international institutions and the key role that the United States plays in supporting them. We present the Stevenson Award to individuals who spent their careers working on U.S. engagement with the United Nations, educating the public about UN issues, and furthering international cooperation. The Princeton area chapter of the United Nations believes that the retired Ambassador Daniel Kurtzer follows this spirit. He is currently here at the Wilson School. He is the S. Daniel Abram Professor of Middle East Policy Studies. He has co-authored 2 books, Negotiating Arab-Israeli Peace and The Peace Puzzle. He also edited another volume, Pathways to Peace. He's published many articles on the Middle East peace process and been quite active in conferences and presentations, as well as op-eds and a blog I'm sent often. Thank you very much. He earned his PhD from Columbia University. He also had a 29 career in the U.S. Foreign Service and was a key person in formulating and implementing U.S. Middle East policy for both Democratic and Republican administrations. From 2001 to 2005, he was the U.S. Ambassador to Israel. And from 1997 to 2001, he was the U.S. Ambassador to Egypt. He retired in 2005 with the rank of Career Minister. Ambassador Kurtzer has been on the front line of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, having to weigh difficult trade-offs in power, peace, and human rights that few of us are prepared to handle. He has done so with a remarkable degree of rationality, civility, and commitment to international cooperation that sadly seems scarce today. Whatever one's views on the broader Middle East peace process, I suggest that we can all agree on the need for a substantive yet respectful dialogue under the auspices of the United Nations. For his active role in furthering that vision, both as ambassador and as a scholar, the chapter would like to present its 2017 Adlai Stevenson Award to Daniel Kurtzer. Pose for a photo.
Okay.
Now we'll take this back.
Okay, great.
Now, make sure you join us for dinner to get your
Okay.
And without further ado, Dr. Kurtzer is going to talk to us about peace processes and human rights. Is there a contradiction Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Daniel Kurtzer.
Thank you, Dan.
Good afternoon. I want to thank the United Nations Association and all of those who participated in deciding on this award for honoring me with it. Awards and rewards are usually in short supply for those who have spent their careers working on the Middle East. I do want to offer a special thanks to a colleague and friend, Brian Potter of the College of New Jersey, who's also the president of this chapter, and find that it's especially fitting, as you know from past years, that this award is named for Adlai Stevenson. Arthur Schlesinger, the renowned historian, once said that Stevenson was a voice of reasonable, civilized, and elevated America, something that may be in short supply these days, but the fact that we can look back at this statesman with pride tells us that we're still okay as a country. I'm especially honored, therefore, to be given this award in the name of Adlai Stevenson, who fought for what was right, even when it was not necessarily convenient. Having been honored by this award, I'm also humbled because we're in a town in which Michael Walzer over at the Institute for Advanced Studies, Gary Bass in this school, are renowned experts in the field of human rights and humanitarian concerns. And I approach this issue much more as a former practitioner rather than as an academic, and hope that the combination of the thoughtfulness of the scholars in this field, together with some experience that I've had both in dealing with peace processes as well as with human rights concerns, might advance the prospects in both of these areas. Stevenson once said that making peace is harder than making war. And again, having worked on the Middle East peace process for 30 years during my time in government, and now for the past almost 12 years here at Princeton in the publications and teaching, I can certainly attest to the veracity of Stevenson's comment. Peacemaking does force adversaries to confront the most basic issues that divide them and the issues that prompted them to fight in the first place. Even a cursory examination of various forms of conflict suggests how challenging it is to devise ways of resolving those conflicts. Conflicts derive from the problems of colonialism, colonial legacy, especially in multi-communal societies. They derive from struggles of leadership. Two or more people or factions within a country that want to attain leadership and are ready to fight for it. There are territorial conflicts, whether within a country or between countries, that we have seen. Very deep conflicts over values and beliefs, over ideology, conflicting history, and conflicting narratives. Equally deep conflicts over religion and ethnicity and nationalism. Over human needs, something that we sometimes take for granted in this country, but which presents such challenges around the world. Just physical survival and well-being, access to food and housing, shelter, health care, that prompts people to fight each other. And rebellion against authoritarianism and despotism and dictatorship, and those who abuse human rights and values. In each of these conflicts, there are multiple variables and considerations to assess when to consider making peace. How do you deal with leaders in conflict if you're trying from the outside to mediate a conflict? What weight should be assigned to the tangible and intangible issues in dispute, such as territory, mineral problems, wealth, ideology, religion, and so forth? It's also necessary to make judgments in the conflict resolution process about the scope and intensity of the conflict itself and the goal of the peace process. For example, is it a short-term process which one is seeking to solve an immediate problem, or are you trying to solve the core issues at stake between the conflicting parties? Or are you seeking to manage a conflict, understanding that it may not be amenable to being resolved at this time? Is it a conflict that's characterized by total conflict, or is it limited in scope? Obviously, a more limited conflict will lend itself more easily to resolution than a total conflict, but it becomes important to judge what kind of totality or non-totality one is dealing with when one enters into the conflict resolution process. What's the conflict's intensity, and what's the staying power of the various parties? Obviously, here too, a conflict that's less intense might be easier to resolve. If the parties to a conflict believe that they have the staying power, it's going to be more challenging and difficult to resolve. There's the question that was offered in a comment many years ago by an Israeli general turned scholar called the Balance of Essentiality. In other words, for which side in a conflict is it more important to win and maybe more able to lose? The classic example, of course, is the French colonialism in Algeria. France did seek to integrate Algeria into French society, into the French metropole, but for Algerians, this conflict was a conflict over independence, sovereignty, self-determination. And therefore, in this conflict, the balance of essentiality was on the side of the Algerian revolutionaries, who ultimately, after a long insurrection and revolution, prevailed. And finally, what are the human costs of a conflict, both in terms of the casualties, those injured, those displaced internally, those who are refugees, migrants, as well as the casualties in terms of human rights and basic needs? It's important to take a look at several ways in which the parties to a conflict have assessed themselves what's at stake and how that influenced the course of events in the subsequent peace processes in each of these conflicts. For example, today, the struggle for dominance in the Middle East transcends a simple definition of power politics, and it involves also questions of religion, the so-called Sunni-Shia divide. It involves questions of identity. Are people in the region simply to be defined by their religion, by their tribe, by their locality, by their state, or by the larger Arab nation, the Ummah, or by all of the above? We tend to think of ourselves as people with multiple personalities. We are citizens of Princeton, New Jersey, the United States. We have our particular religions, we have our political views, we have economic identities, we have social identities. These are important factors for us, and one can imagine how important they become for parties in conflict. In this context, how do people in the Middle East, for example, make choices when it comes to the grievances of others or the suffering on the part of the region's population? Back in 1990, you recall that when Iraq invaded Kuwait, the United States at that time marshaled an international coalition which included key Arab states, the first time ever that Arab states joined a Western coalition to fight against Arabs. How did they self-identify in terms of the choices they were making? In this case, it was a question that they faced of a country invading, in fact, swallowing up another country and its resources, which overcame other questions of identity with respect to religion and the larger question of Arab nationalism. The second issue, when looking at how parties to a conflict assess themselves, relates to the grievances that are connected to issues of justice or the perceptions of wrongs done by one party to another or by the government to the population. The example that comes to mind, of course, is the situation that existed in South Africa, the struggle for the end of apartheid, and how that society dealt with these wrenching internal issues which affected the entire population, whether black or white. The struggle for primacy in Northern Ireland, which pitted Catholics against Protestants, was not simply a religious challenge, but it became one that essentially was existential for both populations. Or even the 2011 revolution in Tunisia, in which, starting as a result of a particular grievance against a fruit salesman escalated immediately into a full-scale revolution and the abdication from office of the president. The third dimension in this issue relates to the goals of the parties in dispute. When one side perceives the goals of the other as uncompromising or existential. One can cite the examples in Kashmir or in the Korean Peninsula, where both sides perceive that their involvement in this process calls into very question their existence as a people, as a nation, as a state, and therefore raises the stakes for each of them as they approach a possible conflict resolution process. And a fourth dimension, of course, relates to the depth and depravity of the violence and the persistence and pervasiveness of human rights violations. And there are, unfortunately, too many examples of conflicts that involve this, whether it's in the Great Lakes, Hutus versus Tutsis, South Sudan, today in Syria, or the humanitarian crisis that we're facing in Yemen. I've worked on peace processes for many years, not only in the Middle East, but also with respect to the Balkans and the Turkish Cypriot, Greek Cypriot problem in Cyprus. And I've also had responsibility during my tours of duty in the State Department for trying to advance American human rights goals. These two critical imperatives were usually pursued in parallel, and we tried to pursue them as adequately and as significantly as we could. But we never actually pursued them as an integral whole. And they were always seen as parts of different issues in which the United States was trying to advance its interests. In other words, while trying to make peace between Israelis and Arabs, or Greek or Turkish Cypriots, or people in the Balkans, we would look at our work in the peace process as somehow divorced from or separate from the necessity to confront and deal with human rights problems and humanitarian issues. This bias included not only issues related to governments involved in the peace process, how they treated their own citizens or the people under their control, but extended also to issues such as transitional justice. What do parties do after a conflict to deal with those who were responsible for the conflict and for human rights abuses? In this respect, Gary Bass here at the university has done tremendous work in trying to analyze this question and what it's meaning. And how do you deal with human rights abuses that persist after a peace accord and is not part and parcel of the peace accord's implementation? Now, there were examples over the years of how you could integrate some aspects of this into a peace process. For example, in South Africa, as part of the reconciliation process after the end of apartheid, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established, which, according to its mandate, was based on legislation that said a commission is necessary to exercise and enable South Africans to come to terms with their past on a morally accepted basis and to advance the cause of reconciliation. A second example was the United Nations establishment of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia to deal with war crimes. Like the Nuremberg trials after World War II, this tribunal demonstrated that an individual's senior position did not afford protection from prosecution. And a third similar example occurred when the United Nations established the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda to, quote, prosecute persons responsible for genocide and other serious violations of international humanitarian law committed in the territory of Rwanda and neighboring states. The connection between the search for peace and the search for justice and human rights does seem clear and unassailable, but it is in reality complicated. Some questions need to be asked. Should a peace agreement be concluded, and is it viable if it does not produce justice, and if it does not address the human rights abuses that took place before the agreement came into effect? Should a peace agreement be contingent on the inclusion of a mechanism to deal with current and future human rights abuses? as well as transitional justice. That is, bringing to account those who are responsible for past abuses? Or is the importance of peace such that it should be pursued even if past human rights violations go unpunished and there is no mechanism to deal with them after the agreement goes into effect? Indeed, the ancient question is, can there be peace without justice? And can justice be achieved in the absence of peace? Over the past few years at this school, we have examined in some of my courses these issues in task forces that have looked at the efficacy of diplomacy in dealing with protracted conflicts. In every case study undertaken by my students, issues related to human rights figured in some important aspect of the conflict and the conflict resolution process. And for example, the questions that related to the outbreak of conflict, its continuation, its intensification, and its basic protractedness. Students did case studies on Colombia, where we are now trying to celebrate the achievement of a peace agreement, but where we saw over the years ongoing human rights challenges scuttled earlier attempts at peacemaking, or in South Sudan, or in the Great Lakes, or in the Middle East's many conflicts. When peace process does not succeed, not solely because of the failure to address human rights issues, those issues did figure among the array of unresolved problems. In fact, in almost every case study we examined, one conclusion repeated itself time and time again. As challenging as it is to embed human rights considerations in the process of peacemaking or in the conclusion of a peace agreement, a durable peace requires governments to treat their people and those of their former adversary with respect. In other words, respect for human rights. This may seem common sense, but it's not. And it certainly is not easy, one of the reasons why Adlai Stevenson said that it's sometimes harder to make peace than to make war. Why is the common sense in this case not easy? Well, to be sure, on the positive side, human rights advocates and conflict resolvers do often share similar goals. They both want to bring violence to an end. They both want to reduce casualties and the loss of life. They both want to minimize human suffering and to stabilize an unstable situation. They want to address underlying causes of violence so as to prevent its recurrence. And they want to find areas of agreement to commit warring parties or those engaged in violence to stop fighting and to make a transition to a peaceful situation. These groups, however, well-meaning, don't necessarily always speak the same language, however, and they don't necessarily agree on the same methods. Human rights advocates tend to be judgmental. There are human rights violators and there are human rights victims. Situation is black or white. Conflict resolution people, on the other hand, are more often focused on stopping hot conflicts and sometimes willing to cut a deal with bad actors, to set aside the question of responsibility for abuses if that is what is required to end a conflict. Human rights advocates ground their work in international law and in human rights norms that are universally accepted. Conflict resolvers work in terms of process, well honed through history, but with rules that are not codified in international law. Human rights advocates press governments to end human rights violations and to ensure that individuals responsible for abuses are held accountable. Conflict resolvers try to help the parties to a conflict satisfy conflicting interests and to bridge conflicting narratives. They would like the abusers to face justice, but often believe that such a goal would scuttle the chances of an agreement. Look at Myanmar today, where over 130 ethnic groups compete and where multiple insurgencies are underway in an environment in which the government cannot even abide the name Rohingya. Or the Track 2, in which I was involved with Russia to deal with Syria, and the impossibility to raise the issue of transitional justice in the context of a political transition. One question then is whether there are enough commonalities in the purposes and approaches of human rights advocates and peace processors that might help shape better outcomes. The literature suggests a few such commonalities for our consideration. One is the question of participation and inclusion. That is, to ensure that as many stakeholders as possible are brought into a peace process and to assure that all parties have some input into a final resolution. Participation per se is not a guarantee that a group's views will find their way into a final agreement, but the process of peacemaking will need to accommodate this input in some ways, either during the negotiations, during implementation, or afterwards. Participation and inclusion are not simple matters, for this often means the involvement of enemies, disruptive elements, spoilers, and the like, people that previously never dealt with each other. It's also always more convenient to deal with those committed to a peace process, but doing so threatens that those left out of a peace process and with no stake in the outcome will feel free to try to undermine whatever is agreed. The second potential commonality is the question of empowerment. Peace processes normally engage official government representatives, empowered to speak for the policies of the government that they represent. Human rights advocates normally sit outside the government and, in a sense, represent a cause rather than a formal position or set of interests. Integrating human rights advocates into a peace process thus becomes a form of empowerment, where a seat at the table offers a kind of neutral ground on which to argue for the rights and norms that the human rights communities advocate. The third issue involves cultural sensitivity and equity. As hard as it is to imagine, the mere possibility of the Burmese armed forces, the Tatmadaw, possibly sitting with the Rohingya to talk, let alone negotiate, would reflect an enormous degree of cultural sensitivity that could go a great distance in reducing the violence in Myanmar and perhaps launching a process of national reconciliation. In the early 1980s, while serving in the Middle East, I wrote an early dissent memo to the Secretary of State, arguing that the restrictions placed on our ability to dialogue with certain parties in the Middle East who were considered to be terrorists actually hampered our ability to resolve conflicts. I didn't write that memo because I liked the terrorists, and I didn't write that memo because I thought that they were particularly good people. But if we're going to have a peace process, we're going to have to deal with the people who are most challenging to the idea of achieving that peace. Pie in the sky, perhaps, but without recognizing these diversities within or between pluralistic societies, there's actually little chance of a peace process taking hold and a little chance that human rights violations will be addressed. Thus, just by starting to treat all parties to the conflict with cultural sensitivity, respect, and on something of an equal basis may actually help us achieve peace. I have no neat conclusion to these remarks, but rather have raised a series of questions to challenge our thinking about how one does approach conflict resolution processes through a peace process, while integrating as much as possible both the question of human rights abuses, the question of transitional justice, and how that will work itself out in the future. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to take some questions. I assume there may be a question or two about the Middle East today. So I'll do that as well. Our tradition here at Princeton is to allow students to ask the first questions. And so if there are any student questions, there's certainly a mic over here. There's one here, if they would line up here. And if there are no student questions to begin with, then certainly the community is invited. And if there are no questions, then we can have an easy early dinner.
Thank you, Ambassador Kurtzer. I know everyone is probably wanting to ask you the same, and you published something about it today. Could you comment on the impact of the new initiative to move the capital of Israel to Jerusalem?
Mariana is one of my students. I did not plant that question. For those who are interested, I published an op-ed today in the Daily News, and you might have seen me almost all day yesterday as a talking head on various news outlets. The view that I expressed basically asks the question of what is the upside of the president's decision to do so. We know that it's in fulfillment of a campaign pledge. All previous presidential candidates in the last 25 years have made the pledge to move the American embassy to Jerusalem and to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. All presidents in the last 25 years, once assuming office, have decided that Jerusalem being as sensitive an issue in an extremely complex conflict and conflict resolution process, have decided to defer taking that decision. The Congress, in its wisdom in the mid-1990s, decided to take action in its own hands and mandated that the embassy be moved to Jerusalem, but offered the president the ability to waive those provisions if it was in, I think the language was, the national security interest of the United States, which each president invoked when signing the waiver, believing that not signing the waiver would undercut our ability to play the role of a mediator, honest broker, third-party intermediary in the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. By changing this policy, the Trump administration, President Trump, has certainly addressed a campaign promise that he met. He has satisfied a part of his base, probably a significant part of his base. He has certainly satisfied the current government in Israel and even others in Israel who don't necessarily support the government, but who have wondered for many years why the world doesn't recognize the capital that Israel has chosen for itself. But in so doing, President Trump has isolated the United States from every other country in the world. For those of you who saw Tom Friedman's article, he also did it with no particular gain for the United States. In other words, there was no nuance, there was no ask of Israel or give to the Palestinians that would be seen as somehow fulfilling our role as an honest broker and intermediary. And this was the question, the basic question that I asked in the article that I wrote this morning. There are other reasons as well. We saw some of it today. There was some violence in the West Bank. Everybody is bracing for violence after the mosque services on Friday. Interestingly, as the president was making his remarks, the State Department put out a warning against travel to these regions. The State Department saying basically that our policy is likely to incite violence in some quarters, violence which is not at all to be accepted in any way, but is probably likely. The last thing I noted in the article was that with a little bit of creative thinking, this actually could have been done in a manner that would have advanced the prospects for peace. After all, the president, when he assumed office last January, inherited a moribund peace process. And there was no particular reason to believe that anything he did was going to advance the prospects for peace. We all would have understood, even those of us who have spent 40 years in the trenches of peacemaking, would have understood if the president said, hey, I got other priorities and I'm not going to focus. But he raised expectations. Day after the election, he told the Wall Street Journal he could make the ultimate deal, signed his son-in-law responsibility for it. They've been working on this process for a year. President himself took on this idea, this initiative that he could make peace. And so, in fact, what he has done is shot himself in the foot. Been trying to figure out a way to frame it. You know, it's maybe an own goal in soccer or an unforced error. I think the best way to describe it is you're trying to move the ball down the field and you decide to simply fumble it You don't fumble it by accident, but you decide to fumble it. And that's what the president did yesterday. Now, the last thing I'd say in answer to Mariana's question is, could this have been done in a way that would advance the peace process? And the answer is yes. And there were ideas out there, including some that I had put forward over the years, and I included one of them in this article. What if the president had said the following? The United States recognizes Jerusalem as the capital of the state of Israel, and we will recognize Jerusalem as the capital of the state of Palestine once it's negotiated. The United States is ready to move its embassy to Jerusalem, to West Jerusalem, to represent our interests vis-a-vis Israel, and we commit to establish our embassy in East Jerusalem to represent our interests vis-a-vis Palestinians. Whoa, the world would have said. The U.S. has done something that actually is interesting. It's creative, it's different. It also satisfies some of Israel's concerns. It gets the Israelis a little bit nervous because we have challenged their idea that Jerusalem is only theirs. They talk about an eternally unified capital for themselves. But we've also been very realistic that for Palestinians to ever agree to a peace treaty, they are going to have a capital in Jerusalem as well. The question is where, what the borders will be, what the arrangements will be. So if you want to do creative diplomacy, you do something like that. It doesn't have to be exactly what I advocated, but you do something that actually places yourself as an honest broker. We didn't do that yesterday. And I think the ramifications, even if the violence dies down in the region, the ramifications for U.S. diplomacy are profound and long-lasting, unfortunately. Let's go here, please.
Thank you. As we approach humanitarian catastrophes and crises, to what extent do you think the United States should consider United Nations policies like the responsibility to protect? Thank you.
Look, it took a long time for the international community, the United Nations, to have this idea of what's called R2P, responsibility to protect, to become part of the lexicon of international norms. And it was tested, as you recall, in 2011 as the basis of the resolution that authorized the use of force in Libya. If you go back to that resolution, that focused on the protection of Libyans who were basically going to be under siege and probably under attack in Benghazi. And the idea was that international forces would be authorized by the United Nations to intervene to protect them. The problem is that the international force that went into Libya actually went in with other motivations, and that was regime change. A lot of those who supported or abstained on the Security Council resolution became disillusioned with the concept of responsibility to protect because of the way it was played out in Libya. If we're going to recover the idea of responsibility to protect, the argument has to be made convincing that it really is designed to protect people who are under siege or under danger in conflicts and not used as a pretext for other purposes, as in the case of Libya, where the pretext became the killing of Gaddafi and regime change. So bottom line, it's a critically important advance in international human rights, humanitarian law. It now needs to be respected by virtue of its real meaning, which is actually to protect people. Yeah.
Scholarship, of course, is an important part of the I guess, understanding the causes for various conflicts and arriving at peace. Yet we've seen in many volatile regions that scholars are being locked out or locked up, whether it's Venezuela, where glaciologists can't study climate change there, or Princeton's own graduate student being detained in Iran. What can the United States do, I guess, to promote scholarship around the world and try to ensure that there are safe environments where people can study these problems so that we can get to a solution?
You know, the reality is that we can do a lot, if not through active intervention, because we cannot really be the world's policeman, but through the bully pulpit. That means if the United States is truly seen as a leader, as we have been for a great deal of time since World War II, then our messages carry significant weight. Just take a look until recently, the reaction to the annual human rights reports that are issued by the State Department. In most cases, there is no follow-up to what goes on in these human rights, what's written in the human rights reports, other than what our diplomats carry out day to day. They will go and make démarches to governments and ask for changes. But in practical terms, the reports mostly act as a form of memorializing what the situation is on the ground. And countries react in incredibly strong ways to what's in those reports because the United States has issued them. Now, the prerequisite to making that bully pulpit work is that we be seen as a leader internationally, that we be respected as a leader internationally, that we walk the walk as well as talking the talk, as it were. And I go back to the answer to the first question. To the extent that we isolate ourselves and take ourselves out of such international conventions or regional conventions as the Middle East peace process, which we have done, or the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which this administration has now pulled us out of, or the Paris Climate Accord, or even what we do at home that's watched closely around the world as we constrict the work of various agencies and our respect for our environment and ecology, then you lose the ability to have an impact when you speak about human rights abuses, the locking up of teachers and so forth. I worked in government at a time when a president spoke, it meant something. There were reverberations. Did it always accomplish a purpose? Not necessarily, but you gave the diplomatic arm of the United States something to work with because people were paying attention. I just hope that we can recover that leadership and then continue to have some impact on these issues.
Hello, Ambassador. My question is actually an elaboration on Mariana's question. So the recent decision by President Trump certainly does make the peace process more challenging. In your view, what levers remain for a peace process towards a two-state solution? And do you think that a two-state solution is still feasible?
The answer to the second question is yes. What the president said yesterday does not take us any further away, does not remove the possibility of a two-state solution or diminish its importance. It does take the United States out of the game of trying to make peace, but in practical terms, there isn't an alternative to having two states. I hate to do this, but I would refer you to an article I wrote just a few weeks ago actually, I like to do it, but humility tells me to say I hate to do it. In a publication called the Cairo Review, which laid out basically 10 policy suggestions that the United States could undertake, even realizing that they were unlikely to advance the process immediately, but they would put U.S. diplomacy on an extremely strong basis and allow us to pursue a very significant and strong peace process. The most important of these was for the United States to articulate parameters or terms of reference for negotiations. What that means is, many of you in the audience have been involved in negotiations in your professions and your businesses, and you don't walk into a negotiating room without terms of reference, because otherwise you may be talking about apples and the other side is going to be talking about oranges. You have to have a common set of issues, and you have to try to narrow those issues as much as you can in advance so that you have a prospect for actually bridging the differences. We happen to know a great deal about what Palestinians and Israelis have negotiated over the years. There was some progress made at Camp David in 2000. Didn't reach an agreement, but progress was made. Two sides made further progress at Taba in 2001. They made further significant progress after the Annapolis Peace Conference in 2008, and that was carried forward by Secretary Kerry in 2013-14. The issues in dispute between the two sides have been narrowed to a significant degree. And therefore, it's up to the parties themselves to try to agree on terms of reference, but in fact they won't, which suggests, therefore, that the United States ought to put them out as a matter of our policy and say to the parties, when you are ready to go back to negotiations, which you may not be ready now, but when you are ready to do so, this is what we are urging you, the parameters within which we're urging you to negotiate. You don't start from here, you start from here. Furthermore, one of my second points in this decalogue of ideas was to then incorporate US policy into a Security Council resolution. And the reason for that is the basis for peacemaking in the Middle East between Arabs and Israelis is UN Security Council Resolution 242 that was adopted November 22nd, 1967, more than 50 years ago. Now, it's got tremendous resilience because we're still using it, but it really is out of date. So one effect of putting out new terms of reference and then incorporating them in a Security Council resolution would be to update the basic terms of reference of a peace process. There are 8 others. I'm not going to go over all of them because I do want you to read the article. But they suggest an integrated American policy that would put us in extremely strong position to recover our ability to act as a real significant mediator, honest broker between the two sides. Yeah.
Speaking of...
If I don't answer this question right, are you going to take the plaque back?
No. No, and
Whatever you say
I don't.
is right.
I don't think there's a right answer to this question, but I'm curious on your thoughts. When we speak of apples and oranges and of two sides talking about entirely different things, when we look at Israel and Palestine, we talk about issues such as the security checkpoints and the encroaching settlements. We talk about the historical blockade and a host of other issues. And one side, the Palestinians, are talking about this as human rights and development issues, and Israel is talking about this as security issues. So when we think about human rights as being a very important player in a peace process, in the Israel and Palestine peace process, the ongoing discussions or the attempt to continue some diplomacy between both sides, how do we get to a point where we can have both sides talking about the same thing or referring to the same thing in the same way?
You know, one of I think the easiest way to understand an extremely complex conflict resolution process is to think about it as a multi-layered chess game. And that's going to be hard, but that's the easy way to look at it. You have one layer, which is the traditional peacemaking effort, which is what's called top-down. You take the core issues, borders, security, Jerusalem, settlements, refugees, economic relations, and you get the two sides to sit at the table and you talk about them and try to come up with compromises. It's absolutely critical, but it's not sufficient. Second way to look at a peace process is bottom up. How do you, and it relates to some of your points in your question, how do you improve the situation on the ground to a point where people actually feel that they can sit and talk to each other? This relates to settlement activity on the one side. It relates to violence emanating from the Palestinian side. I don't equate them morally, but they are equally challenging to a peace process. It relates to building permits. It relates to prisoners. It relates to human rights abuses, and. Doing that is critically important, but that's not enough, because what that can do is improve the situation on the ground, but it doesn't advance you towards peace. A third way to look at it is what's called outside in. The Arab world has been sitting aside for too many years. In 2002 came up with the Arab Peace Initiative, which suggested that they would play a role in promoting security and peace after peace had already been achieved. Well, life doesn't work that way. They have to start contributing now. They have to help Palestinians, not just financially, but also as a political safety net. They have to reach out to Israel and convince the Israeli public that the Arab world is ready to deal with Israel as a contributing party in the Middle East. And the fourth part of this multi-layered chessboard is what each society has to do itself. Israel has a lot to think about with respect to its own behavior in the territories that it occupies. On one side of that green line, as the temporary armistice line is called, Israel is one of the most advanced democracies in the world. I used to periodically sit in the Knesset and watch a real town hall democracy at work. Now, they shout at each other, and they often will drag Knesset members out, but it is a marvelous expression of freedom of expression and of political debate and of the earnestness by which Israelis take their democracy. You cross that green line, and Israel is an occupying power that denies Palestinians basic rights and impedes their ability to develop economically. So part of the fourth layer is what Israel has to do internally. And the other part of the fourth layer, which the former Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority, Salam Fayyad, spoke to just a few weeks ago here, is what the Palestinians have to do themselves. They have to become agents of their own destiny. They need to feel that empowerment gives them not just an opportunity, but an obligation to take control of their lives, to put forward visions and ideas and platforms and proposals, and not just to be in a rejection state or to assume that others will do it for them. So if you want a peace process that's integrated, that includes the 10 points or more that I've suggested, think about it in these multiple layers where you have top down, bottom up, outside in, and the internal responsibilities of each party. If you think about it in those terms, then human rights gets subsumed in every one of those categories because it's an issue for bilateral governmental negotiations. It's an issue for improving the situation on the ground. It's an issue which Arab states have to be held accountable for. I wouldn't take a lot of human rights advice from Saudi Arabia, for example. So if they're going to involve in a peace process, they're going to be expected to also advance their own human rights agenda. And both Israel and the Palestinian Authority also have to improve the humanitarian and human rights considerations within their own society. Stevenson said, peace is harder than making war, and he wasn't kidding. As hard as it is for our military to do what they're asked to do, just think about trying to develop a strategy and then a set of policies and tactics and tools to advance an agenda that includes all these multiple layers of issues. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much
Do
for
I
the
keep
talk.
the plaque? Oh, I'm sorry. It's inscribed, okay.
Thank you so much. I just had a question about, you mentioned the distinction between advocates of human rights and advocates for conflict resolution. So you mentioned that human rights advocates are basing what they're arguing for in something that's codified, it's universal, it's a set of laws and legal structures, whereas people who want conflict resolution, it's more about the process and historical example. So why is it that there are more examples of human rights in the peace process being the element that's more often overlooked and kind of thrown out the window? Where even, I think it's something you mentioned, and it's just a common human feeling of human rights being something that's very serious, something very logical to be dedicated for. Why is it that it's so easily overlooked if it's so grounded in law? And
look, it's a complicated problem, and it goes to one of the core questions that I posed, which is if you're trying to advance a peace process and you've got these serious, incredibly important human rights problems that in their own right are very difficult to resolve, do you hold up the peace process in order to try to integrate them? Or do you advance the peace process in the hope that maybe things will get better afterwards? And that's the dilemma. I don't have an answer to the question. In an ideal peace process, you increase participation, as I suggested. You include respect for parties that you have been battling each other. You do the kinds of inclusive things that bring these issues to the table while you're trying to negotiate what I called previously the top-down issues. But it's very hard to do. I think South Africa is an extraordinary example in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, even though, frankly, it hasn't worked perfectly. It's not a perfect solution. But the fact that as South Africa transitioned from apartheid and tried to do so peacefully, And there was understanding that there had to be some dealing with history, that history wasn't simply something that could be papered over, is an extraordinary example for all of us. The two commissions, the international tribunals that I mentioned, are also important, but they're limited in nature to the two particular conflicts. It's just very, very hard to do. And frankly, since governments are the ones who negotiate the peace treaties, they have a tendency to try to negotiate a peace treaty and not solve every problem that's out there, such as human rights. It's just an unfortunate reality.
You mentioned the bully pulpit as a way for the United States to advance its interests and how this relies on a degree of international respect for the United States. Given the changes at the State Department since Trump has taken office with numerous diplomats and policymakers leaving, is the United States going to lose some of its ability to do this? And will a future president need to recuperate this?
Yeah. There was a great article the other day, an op-ed in the New York Times by Ambassador Ryan Crocker, who's here this year, and Ambassador Nicholas Burns was up at Harvard talking about this issue, which is the gutting of the State Department, the gutting of our diplomatic capacity to carry out diplomacy. You know, on the one hand, for many years we have known that the State Department is organizationally dysfunctional. It's a mess of offices and special envoys and special this and special that, and it's very hard to find coherence in that organizational structure. But the State Department has also been undermanned and underfunded, so much so that successive secretaries of defense have publicly said that the State Department needs a larger budget. And they've done it for narrow reasons. They don't want to do the work that the State Department can't do because they don't have enough people to do so. So now you have a situation where not only is Secretary Tillerson trying to reorganize the department, which is commendable, but he has accepted, or says he's ready to accept, a 31% budget cutback. He hasn't filled key positions, both in Washington and our embassies abroad. The methodology of his diplomacy has been very restricted, where many people in the department don't even know what they're supposed to know about their own portfolios, let alone about larger policy issues. And the policy process has been largely confined to the people that the Secretary of State brought in himself and now sit in the Policy Planning Bureau, Policy Planning staff. So it's a very, very significant problem. The bully pulpit can be occupied by the president, and in fact, that's the most effective use of that pulpit, because when the president speaks, presumably others around the world should listen. But if there's no follow-up and no people to follow up, and we don't have an ambassador in important places, and we don't have an assistant secretary to figure out the strategy for taking what the president said and actualizing it, you know, all it becomes is kind of a holler in the wind, and nothing emerges from it. So it's a very serious problem. So far, the Congress is pushing back a little bit on Secretary Tillerson, saying they don't agree on the kind of budget cuts that he's prepared to take. Secretary Mattis in the Defense Department has said, if you don't want the $57 million, I'll take it, because I can figure out what to do with it. But it's short-sighted on his part, because if he takes it, he's going to end up doing what the State Department should be doing, but can't do because they don't have the personnel to do it. So it's an additional problem in implementing our policy.
First of all, thank you for being here, for the work you do and the work you've done. My question is regarding the American relationship with Saudi Arabia. What is your stance on whether or not this is an alliance that should be continued in its current form, whether or not it should be modified, or even possibly relinquished entirely in favor of other Middle Eastern allies?
Yeah, it's a good question, because it takes you back to history, as well as what is the definition of U.S. interests with respect to a country like Saudi Arabia. The historical relationship starts with Franklin Roosevelt and goes back essentially to the restructuring of our Navy and the need for oil. I mean, this is, if you want to cut through everything else, this is what drove Great Britain and the United States to look for additional sources of oil. And fossil fuels. And the United States determined 70 years ago, that you make friends with the place that has the oil, and that's Saudi Arabia, in the eastern provinces where Aramco is located. That came at a cost. We have overlooked significant human rights abuses by the Saudis, religious coercion by the Saudi religious establishment, very significant restrictions on freedoms and rights for Saudi citizens. But it has been determined by successive presidents that the overriding nature of our energy requirements and the energy requirements of our allies took precedence. And that was a decision that has been made and reiterated over the years. I think it's now being called into question. Just yesterday, overlooked because of the Jerusalem announcement, was a one-line statement that came out of the White House critical of the Saudi Arabian intervention in the Yemen war, which has created what the newspapers are saying is the most significant humanitarian crisis of the day. The Saudis have blockaded Yemen, and there are people starving and the society has been impacted in a way that will carry forward for many years. Is this the beginning of a rethinking of the overall nature of the relationship? Probably not. But is it the beginning of trying to balance it a little bit, where we can go to the Saudis and say, look, we value the contribution you make to stabilizing world energy prices and supply, and we value you as a customer for our arms, which we have sold a lot of them, but you got to do better on human rights. Is that going to happen? I don't know. One can only hope that that's the case. Yeah.
Thank you for your wisdom and insights and distilling them for us. If there is going to be a hiatus now, since the US is not going to be seen as an honest broker, what opportunities does it provide for others to fill that gap? Paradoxically, does it offer opportunities, for example, to the Europeans who might have always sort of assumed that the honest broker role is always going to be played by the United States, and therefore they haven't been as perhaps as active as they might have been? And related to that, what about the Russians? Do you see an opportunity for the Russians? Will we be waking up in a few months' time to hear about Vladimir Putin convening a peace conference on his terms?
Yeah. So I wrote an article on this subject too. I published it in a European journal and suggested, even before the president's announcement on Jerusalem, that Europe should stop crying out that it needs a role and actually start to exercise a role. And there are a lot of things that Europe can do or could do even before the president's announcement. Europe is very good at institution building, for example, supporting Palestinian economic development, institution building, so that you don't have a failed state when it comes into being. The Europeans have also traditionally been ahead of the United States in articulating positions that subsequently became integrated into the peace process. You go back to the Venice Declaration in the early 1980s, you fast forward the clock, and a lot of the stuff in the Venice Declaration became commonplace in our peace process parlance. So there was a lot for Europe to do even before yesterday's announcement. The question is whether or not Europe, quote Europe, or individual European countries, France in particular, maybe the UK, Germany, can find a way to address the one issue which has impeded the involvement of anybody else besides the United States, and that is, can they gain enough trust of the Israeli government that Israel would participate in a process in which somebody else besides the US is the broker. Now, Israel has supported or been supportive of the US as a broker because even when we have differences of view, there is a sense in Israel that we really are a solid ally, and we're not going to abandon Israel in time of need. The Israelis are not so sure about others, and if you want to walk into that door and assert a role as a third-party intermediary, you have to have a relationship with both sides in which they trust you to do that. And that gets to the Russia question. Russia has actually done an interesting job of reaching out to a lot of different parties. My graduate students and I were in Moscow for a week just a few weeks ago, and the Russians were very proud that, in fact, they can talk to everybody, whereas the United States doesn't talk to everybody. And on the other hand, they have never done a particularly good job of advancing peace processes. Take Astana and Sochi right now. They're trying to figure out a way to get out of the mess that they have contributed to in Syria, and they have been able to bring much of the opposition on board, meaning the opposition that they haven't created, and therefore there's going to be something that emerges from Astana and Sochi. But you know, if that's an example of what they might do in the Arab-Israeli conflict resolution process, it's not going to be very effective. So the effectiveness of Russia, the ability of Europe to gain the trust of one of the parties become, in both cases, become impediments to anybody else assuming this role. And that's the danger now, because if you don't have an alternative that's real, and if the United States has indeed, as I think it has, shot itself in our foot, and we have to limp along now rather than play an effective role, who's out there to help the parties do this? Yeah.
So I was interested to hear, to what extent do you think popular sovereignty is feasible in the Middle East, and like how much of it is like a goal for like a long-term ideal for the Middle East?
Yeah, it's a great question because, you know, the concept is in many respects alien to the political culture of the Middle East, where sovereignty is not seen as deriving from the people. In some cases, the constitutions of these states suggest that the ultimate authority is Islam, and that everything, not just religious issues, needs to be mediated through or by religious authorities. You know, the poster child for this is Iran, which has tried to create exactly that kind of governance in which there is something of a functioning democracy, but at the end of the day, the decisions have to be either taken or ratified by a supreme religious leader, something that we find unusual, but it's something that they're trying to figure out how to make it work consistent with their interpretation of Islam and Islamic governance. So trying to sell the idea of popular sovereignty may be a bridge too far. You know, what I think people have tried to do, mostly in academia and in think tanks, is to engage in dialogues on this question, to understand better what it is that is the strength of the way we conceive democracy, and what is the strength of the way Arab societies or Muslim majority societies see democracy, and see whether or not there are any points in which the two meet without trying to impose one's ideas or vision on the other. Governments have not been very good at doing this, and in fact, when we've tried, it's normally come out as an imposition of a Western idea. George W. Bush had the Freedom Agenda, which was an agenda that drew very heavily from our own experience, and with which I don't think any of us would argue in terms of our own experience, even as we're trying to get to the ideals that he laid out. But in a sense, it was seen as something that we wanted to impose on others as a model that they needed to follow, and that doesn't really work. Yeah. Jeff.
Thank you, Dan. I wonder if you could walk us through your thoughts on the role of international human rights processes that may either impede or help give birth to a peace settlement. And we'll take Syria as an example, and also Israel-Palestine. In the case of Syria, the UN Human Rights Council created an investigatory commission that has been accumulating enormous documentation on not garden variety, but truly gross human rights abuses, killings, et cetera. But what becomes the kind of vehicle of inserting this into a negotiating process? You had mentioned it would be good to have human rights people at the table, and the UN Security Council adopts these great normative resolutions, human rights people, women, youth, and all that, none of which normally are carrying the guns and are the real parties to the violence of the conflict. Or in the case of Israel-Palestine, the prospect of the Palestinians asking the International Criminal Court to look at the violation of international humanitarian law there. Can these external human rights processes ever serve a helpful role, or are they, as John Bolton would insist, always going to be torpedoing, getting the guys that you need together in the room, the guys with the guns, and get them to an agreement? What works there?
So you mentioned John Bolton just to get my blood boiling, I suppose. Yeah. Thank you very much. The question actually reaches the limit of my academic depth on this. And in fact, Mariana, who asked one of the first questions, with her experience on the ground in and around Syria, may be better positioned to answer this. You might want to ask this later. I would make, I think, two observations, though. Number one, there have been successes in advancing international humanitarian law. I mean, the Geneva Conference, the Geneva Conventions, and the Hague Regulations that deal with how you conduct war and how you relate to prisoners of war and populations affected by war. You know, there's almost universal acceptance of them, even if there is not necessarily universal execution or implementation. But, you know, it's hard to imagine where we would be without them, where we would still be in that Lockean jungle of, you know, kind of no rules, no regulations. Many of you know, our son works for ICRC, is in Myanmar now, and they do tremendous work with limitations. They don't resolve a conflict, but everybody kind of respects their work, and they go into places that diplomats can't go because their work is respected as being universally respected. I'll use that word again. So issue number one, I think, is that there are some advances. I mean, Geneva Conventions are old, but there's always been modifications and updates, and you know, the Swiss government that's the owner or the watchdog of these plays its role assiduously in trying to advance them. That's maybe the good news. But the other news is that when you try to use the United Nations to advance these causes, you're subject to United Nations politics. You know, the business you talked about with respect to violations in Syria, and the investigation just got vetoed by Russia. And, you know, we may or may not know the full results of the investigation, but it certainly is not going to continue. The press just reported a treasure trove of material that's been smuggled out. That will probably have an impact outside the UN because Russia won't allow it inside the UN. So there are limitations because of the way the UN voting system works. You look back in the Arab-Israeli context at the flotilla a few years ago, the Goldstone report, which, as important as it was to look at what happened, was a perversion of the international human rights situation because it equated the actions of a government with the actions of a terrorist organization. And there are no rules that terrorist organizations abide by. We do expect that Israel will abide by rules, and if they don't, let's hold them accountable. But how do you hold Hamas accountable? Or how do you hold the people who sent a flotilla who aren't even part of an organized group? So the UN hasn't figured out a way to deal with this. And you saw with the Goldstone report, it made a big splash once it came out. And then Goldstone himself ultimately walked away from it, basically saying that he was persuaded that it wasn't done as properly as it might have been. So on the one hand, you do have some advances that this thing called human rights and humanitarian law can be integrated in what we do, but you know, once you have to vote on it in a General Assembly, which doesn't always vote according to what's right, but maybe according to what is convenient, and it's a, what? Like the Congress. Yeah, like the Congress, or Security Council, which has the possibility of 5 vetoes, it becomes more problematic. Yeah.
I think we have time for these 2 questions.
2 more questions.
Sorry. Ambassador Kurtzer, thank you for taking the time to talk with us today. My question is regarding China. Recently, China is increasing its soft power and economic creep in areas around the world, regions including the Middle East, and at the same time, as the Trump administration has receded from a leadership position, Xi Jinping has filled the vacuum, and China is now donning the mantle of responsible stakeholder in many new ways. How do you see the trajectory of China on the world stage impacting human rights issues as well as peace and conflict issues?
Okay, I'm way out of my comfort zone here. I wish Tom Christensen was with us. He could really answer this question. Let me approach it not how I see China, but how I see the United States vis-a-vis China. And I'll go back to the TPP question. One of the possibilities of TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, was not just a trade agreement. And we know that Trump doesn't like any trade agreement that was entered into before he became president. And so he was going to look at that trade, the trade aspect of TPP with great suspicion, and that's what prompted him to veto it or to withdraw from it. You look at TPP differently, and China looked at TPP differently as a nascent equivalent of a transatlantic alliance. It was almost like 1945 vis-a-vis Europe, and this we were now creating the infrastructure for a trans-Pacific partnership which would go well beyond trade and would involve relationships and alliances, maybe at some point even security alliances. I'm projecting way into the future, like a NATO or a mini NATO. And so by withdrawing from TPP under those circumstances, not only did we take ourselves out of the game, but you opened up this highway to an ambitious rising power. China is an ambitious rising power, which heretofore has been focused primarily on its near abroad, you know, South China Sea and Tibet and so forth. But this, what do they call it, the Silk Road or?
One Belt, One Road.
Yeah, the One Belt, the old Silk Road, the One Belt, One Road. They've got ambitions. We know what they're doing in Africa in pursuit of mineral wealth. They have ambitions that now extend through Central Asia and will go into the Middle East at some point. And where are we? What are we doing? And I'm not looking for a Cold War with China. I'm looking for a resolute American power to take into account our Pacific interests, because we are a Pacific power as well as an Atlantic power, and there are countries out there that would look to us for an alliance if we were ready to play with them. And right now we're absent. Maybe we can recover it, but in our absence, why wouldn't China take advantage of that? You see it, I mean, the Philippines may be a particular case given its leadership, but you see countries in Asia now with the United States out of TPP rearranging their priorities and rearranging their interests because they have to survive. They're there and they don't see us there, and that's going to be very problematic for us in a region that's going to be increasingly important for the United States and our global interests.
Thank you.
Okay. Last question. It's always dangerous to have a last question.
Thank you, Ambassador Kurtzer. My question goes back to the issue of democracy. Specifically, sort of on the street level in the Middle East, you often hear admiration for Western-style democracy, but the overwhelming sense that we'll never get there, we are not ready, we may never be ready. It's not the same as sort of an antipathy towards the models that you mentioned may have been imposed, or it's been suggested that they're imposed. Can you comment on that disconnect and under what conditions you think that that might change?
Yeah, it's a question that when I was working in state on some of these issues, we constantly posed to ourselves and to our colleagues in AID or the Bureau of what's it called, DHL or whatever, Democracy and Human Rights and Labor. We have never been very good at figuring out an answer to that question. Because we either have been preachy, well, we have a democracy. It may have taken us 250 years to figure it out, but why can't you do it in 6 months? Or if we give you a little aid, maybe it'll take you a year or a little bit more. So we've either been preachy, or we have tended to focus on issues that are important to constituencies in Congress that may not be that important to the host countries. And there's no easy answer to this. One of the reasons I responded earlier to the question of what Europe can do is that Europe, in my experience, has had a better ability to dialogue on these questions, largely because the European experience has been more diverse and maybe because they're also a little less preachy than we are. We had one experience when I was ambassador in Egypt that ended up being quite positive, but then ended. So it's, we worked on it, it was positive, and then it just came to an end. And that was, how do you deal with NGO issues? The Egyptian government doesn't like foreign NGOs. They think that they're intrusive, that they're going to undercut their sovereignty, that they're the secret arm of Western governments to manipulate the society, and they don't like NGOs. We like NGOs, and we like to fund, we like to put a lot of our funding in our assistance programs through NGOs. So you're really at almost opposite ends of this continuum. We started talking to the Egyptians about this and said, look, we don't see our NGOs as having an objective of undermining your government. Rather, we see them as encouraging participation in politics, teaching leaders how to lead, encouraging democratic practices. And we're sensitive to their not becoming the wedge in the door to undermine your civility. Okay, having said that, can't we figure out a way that we can continue to fund them that's not going to be a matter of suspicion for you? And to make a long story short, we came up with the idea of an NGO service center, we called it. It's like a gas station type thing, where we had a couple of representatives from the embassy, a couple of government representatives sitting together and, in a sense, making a final decision with respect to NGO, not individual projects, but NGO platforms, what their goals were. And it worked. There were a couple of things that the Egyptians really didn't want. There were a couple of things that we insisted upon and won. But this idea that we were dialoguing, if I could use that word, advanced this a little bit, okay? And then it ended. And it ended after I left. And I'm not trying to make that connection, but I don't know why it ended. And a few years later, Egypt ended up jailing some of our NGO representatives. That's how bad it got. So, on the one hand, maybe something like this can work across the board where you actually engage in dialogue on hard issues, and maybe it doesn't work. But I like the dialogue part because at least I can point to a success that represents a little bit of a model. On the big question of capital D democracy, I don't have an answer. Thank you very much, everybody.